Washington, Tyne and Weir. The shell of a factory which unleashed a killer still haunts the town today. At the local working men's club, former employees remember absent husbands, wives and friends. They are making the most of life, for there is still a shadow over them. This killer can strike quite suddenly, even after 40 years.
It was just skin and bones before he died. But it was quick to the finish, like, you know, once it takes a hold. Well, I hope I don't have the same to go through. But he has.
The widows and widowers here worked for Newell's Insulation, Washington's main employer. Newell's made asbestos products. They closed in 1980, but the factory has left its mark on generations.
He finished work at 47, died at 57, and when he died, there had to be an inquest. And at the inquest, it was found he was riddled with asbestos. His heart and lungs was covered, sorry about this, with the asbestos.
Asbestos causes a cancer called mesothelioma. Normally it's rare, but not in Washington.
Most of the people that I work with in the box shop are dead now. There's only probably me and a couple more surviving, like, you know.
Not all asbestos diseases are fatal, but mesothelioma never fails to kill.
This is the lining of the lung, which is soft and thin in this patient, who was normal. In this patient, the same piece of tissue has become obviously grossly diseased with enormous thickness and hardness. You can hardly bend this. You can imagine the patient with this in their chest feels extremely uncomfortable indeed.
What does it do to the patient?
It restricts their breathing, and when it invades the surrounding tissues, it causes pain. In the worst possible scenario, one sometimes sees the tumour actually erupting through the skin.
Newell's was the founding partner of a powerful British multinational. Today, its chairman is Colin Hope. He heads a billion-pound empire. The company is a pillar of the commercial establishment. In its annual reports and in polite company, you won't find any mention of the dreaded A word, asbestos, even though it still makes asbestos products. Nor does the company call itself Turner & Newell anymore, the names of its two main asbestos factories. Instead, it goes by their initials, plain T&N. But there are many who will never forget.
I don't really talk about it a lot, you know. Even friends and neighbours all thought I had asthma. I didn't want nobody to know. So I didn't want them all feeling sorry for us. I want to die. It's short life now. In June he said we could go for Christmas. He just said, I honestly don't know, and we'll just keep an eye on the x-rays.
It's already far and away the most important occupational cancer. I mean, there are far more cancer deaths being caused by asbestos now than by all other known occupational carcinogens put together. And it's going to increase threefold over the next 30 years. So in 30 years' time, it's going to be first by an even wider margin.
Stop table going, are we?
No, just leave them be. Just leave them be and they'll merge with the land.
Oh, we're off. We're off.
Turner & Newell wasn't Britain's only asbestos company, but it was the biggest. With power should come responsibility. But just how responsible has the company been? By the 1960s, the board knew full well that asbestos caused cancer, but they continued to market it enthusiastically to buy time to switch to other more profitable products. As a result, thousands suffered and will in the future suffer slow and painful deaths. Turner & Newell has always denied that it continued to sell a product knowing it risked killing people on such a scale. On the contrary, the company claims to have spent money from its comfortable profits on research into asbestos-related disease. But every day now, more and more internal company documents are coming to light, showing that Turner & Newell hid the knowledge that asbestos caused cancer from its workers and customers.
I suspect they saw that there was just so much money. This is a huge multinational group, and it was an empire based on asbestos. And they were not persuaded that enough people were dying or suffering an asbestos-related disease to find substitute materials or shut down and walk away.
In its heyday, Newell's was a vast enterprise. Its factories, railway sidings and slag heaps dominated the local economy and landscape. Newell's made asbestos lagging for shipyards and factories across Britain. It also provided an army of insulation workers. For most of this century, they stitched, hammered and sawed asbestos at the heart of industry. Disease from the dust was rife among the workforce. For those who survived 25 years, the reward was a trip to company headquarters in Washington, Tyne and Weir.
You arrive in Washington and you stay there overnight, and they took you into the place. It was a hall. The managing directors and that would come onto the stage and you get invited forward in turn. They shook hands with you and handed you your award. And you got a cheque for £50.
I name this ship Queen Elizabeth II.
Newell's were laggers by royal appointment. They fireproofed the QE2. John Hughes, his lungs now scarred by asbestos, was the foreman.
It was quite an important part of my career. We were aboard that in 1967 and on to 1969. In the accommodation, there were very roughly about 15 mile of piping, various size of pipes, and about 12 mile of ducting. That's the air conditioning. Then we had the engine room, the boiler room, the propeller shafts and up into the funnel.
A full-time job for hundreds of workers commissioning...
When the QE2 was being built in the 60s, Turner & Newell had suspected for 2 decades that asbestos caused cancer. But still, those working below decks were exposed to the lethal dust. The clinching evidence was unearthed in asbestos mines in South Africa in 1958. Doctors noticed a normally rare form of cancer, mesothelioma, was common among mine workers. Worse, it was affecting not just them, but those who merely lived nearby. It was clear that even slight exposure to asbestos dust could induce the disease many years on. This research, first linking asbestos and mesothelioma, was conducted by Dr. Christopher Wagner. In 1958, Dr. Wagner visited Turner & Newell's headquarters. He warned that tiny quantities of asbestos could cause mesotheliomas which wouldn't be seen for decades. Turner & Newell dismissed Dr. Wagner's findings. A memo said it was clearly incomplete and highly technical. The response followed an alarming pattern. This was the 3rd time in 2 decades that Turner & Newell had been warned asbestos could cause cancer. But for the board, this latest warning was a time bomb.
With mesothelioma, it was proved that even short exposure, comparatively trivial exposure, could produce mesothelioma many years later, 20 to 40 years later. So, in a sense, it was not dose-related. At that time, we thought that very small dosage could produce mesothelioma later on.
And what was the commercial significance of that to the company?
Well, the only possible conclusion was that there should not be any exposure to asbestos fibre. Theoretically, one fibre was one fibre too many.
By the mid-60s, 3 more surveys pointed towards the coming epidemic. Some of the evidence lay right inside Turner and Newell.
During the period that I was there, and it was a period of about 18 months, there were 3 or perhaps 4 cases of mesothelioma deaths from the one factory. I spoke to the chairman of the company about it, and his response was one of embarrassed silence, and he refused to recognize that there were these cases. I asked for permission then to publish the cases so that other people could judge, and that permission was denied me. That was a situation which was untenable so far as I was concerned, and I resigned at that point.
But the then company chairman seemed unmoved.
I think to some extent he developed tunnel vision. He was unable to accept that this was happening. He was as though he'd closed his mind to the possibility, but the evidence was there.
The threat of a cancer epidemic had spread far beyond asbestos companies like Turner and Newell. It hung over the very heart of industry, at shipyards like Swan Hunters on the Tyne. In 1964, 6 years after Dr. Wagner's warning, Michael Watson started there.
He always had this fear that he would never live to an old age because of his job. And he didn't. He didn't live. He thought he would die before he was 45, and he was right, he did. They worked on the ships, obviously, lagging the pipes. There was a lot of putting asbestos on as well, you know, and stripping it off. Relagging old pipes that had been lagged years before, you know, that all needed renewing. It was just a horrible, dirty job to do, and a lot of the jobs were very unpleasant to do.
27 years later, at Christmas 1991, Michael was diagnosed as suffering from mesothelioma.
He knew he didn't have long left because he just wanted to sit up, and he was trying to call my name so I could help him up, and I was trying to lift him, and when I was lifting him up, there was like a fluid. I think it must have been his stomach. His insides were just breaking up. It was just coming out of his mouth and his nose all of the time, and obviously he was panicking. It was choking him. It was right up into his throat, and there was nothing I could do about it, and he knew. He just wanted to cling on as long as he could, and he did for that last day, all day. Everybody wanted to be near him. By then, Mickey was just lying in the bed. He couldn't lift up or anything. The doctor just got to the gate outside, and he breathed his last breath, and he died. And that was it. Just his life gone. 42.
Turner and Newell also pioneered an asbestos blasting system called Limpet. Limpet was highly profitable. It had other hidden qualities too.
When I first joined the company in October '64, John Knox, the then company doctor, told me that the most dangerous process of all was the spraying of asbestos, that this produced the highest discounts, where the operators were all required to wear masks, but not necessarily other people working in or around the area, who were consequently exposed to quite high levels of fibre.
So the company knew that spraying asbestos was going to be very dangerous for bystanders.
That was in 1964, yes.
But the concerns of Dr. John Knox were not shared with Limpet sprayers or those working close by.
You had times there when the nozzle would block up and the fibres would blow back on the machine and spray out all over the place. And by the time the man would put the equipment out of his hand and get back to shut off the air pressure, there'd be clouds of dust everywhere.
Turner and Newell's had fought long and hard against government proposals to provide masks for people working near Limpet. They didn't want to draw attention to the dangers of asbestos. They had argued the proposed inclusion of people working in the vicinity should be most strongly resisted.
Incredible, astounding, unbelievable, amazing. As the building neared completion, reverberating echoes caused an acute acoustical problem.
Although Turner and Newell knew that Limpet was dangerous, they sold it aggressively, using promotional films to prize open overseas markets. This film was made by the company's Canadian subsidiary to advertise Limpet's soundproofing qualities.
Even a dropping board no longer sounds like a clap of thunder, and speech is no longer garbled. Acoustically improved? Yes, by sprayed limpet asbestos.
Limpet was a gold mine and helped transform Turner and Newell into the huge multinational it is today. By 1969, the company was forced to accept tough new controls on asbestos dust. These were to make some products like Limpet unviable, but acceptance of these regulations was part of a hidden agenda for survival. A confidential memo explained Turner and Newell's real attitude to health and safety. It advised a token effort only of ostensible intention to comply with regulations so that the company could ward off the evil day when asbestos cannot economically be applied.
It certainly went on for the whole time I was there, and I understand that it went on for many years afterwards.
And what's your reaction to that?
Well, I think that it's, in a sense, it's criminal.
Today, the Newell's asbestos factory lies derelict, sold off in the rush to diversify away from asbestos. The health scare and new regulations spelt financial ruin. For Doreen Percival, it was too late. In 1968, she was working at Newell's in Washington. Today, she is dying. Her sister has witnessed her decline.
Doreen has changed completely. She hasn't got the energy to do anything. She doesn't want to be left on her own, and she's trying to pack everything in this small time she's got. She knows what's going to happen, and with her seeing my father dying of the same disease, she knows what's going to come to her, and she gets really depressed.
By the late 1960s, deaths from mesothelioma within the Turner and Newell group were rising. But internal documents show that the company had two versions of the threat posed by asbestos. On the one hand, a valued customer who was asking awkward questions was told in 1966, "There is no proof that asbestos can cause mesothelioma, and it is by no means the sole cause of this disease." But a year earlier, Turner and Newell's own company doctor, John Knox, had warned the board, exposure to asbestos, even though it may have been transient and many years previous, is an important factor in mesothelioma of the pleura.
They were protecting the interests of the company. They were ensuring that the company survived. If the warnings had been taken and acted upon, then the company would have folded, I believe.
Looking back, do you discern, though, any other purpose?
Well, I think the longer they survived, then the greater opportunity they had to diversify. And I think that subsequently is what happened. They went into a lot of other fields.
Buying time?
Yes.
It was a deliberate thing to me. That could have been prevented. What he died with. It was there for years, and they knew about it, and they sent the likes of Mickey and all the others that would know of that died with it to their deaths. They could have had some protection for them long, long time ago.
But they didn't. They never bothered.
The scale of it's now clear as far as mesothelioma deaths are concerned. I mean, there are about 1,000 a year in Britain now, most of which are among men. And by the year 2025, in about 30 years' time, that will have increased something like threefold. So there'll be some 2,500, possibly 3,000, including women, mesothelioma deaths occurring each year in Britain. And the total number of deaths that we're talking about caused by asbestos, taking the 50 years from, say, 1975 to 2025, will be more than 50,000. And of course that won't be the end of it. I mean, the epidemic isn't going to vanish in 30 years' time. It's going to continue, possibly for a long time after that. We don't know that because we don't know how much asbestos exposure is taking place today in Britain.
While not responsible for all the deaths to come, the blame for Doreen Percival's lies squarely with Turner and Newell.
On Tuesday, I have to have an X-ray, which Dr. Henderson said this one might be the one where you can tell us how long I've got.
She came to us very, very breathless because she had a massive amount of fluid on her chest. 3 litres of fluid, that's nearly 6 pints of fluid had accumulated on her chest. We took that fluid away, and the examination of that fluid showed us that we had that she had the disease of mesothelioma. We've done actually nothing to treat this lady because actually very little one can do to treat her. The fluid tends to be replaced with vast lumps of tumour, which crush the lung which it surrounds, and that inevitably leads to breathlessness. The tumour tends to grow into the ribs, into the other surrounding tissues, and pain is extremely common and quite difficult to relieve in some cases. How's it been going in that time?
Well, I've got a big pain in the front of the chest.
In the front there?
Yeah, across here. Sometimes it feels as if somebody's jumping up and down on my chest, you know. It's going to cave in.
Is that when you get breathless, it's like that?
Yeah. And at the back, it's like somebody going like that, you know. Or like a burning knife.
Is that keeping you awake at night?
Sometimes, you know, and other times I can't even lie on it. The disease is not galloping on as we had expected, and the fluid level is not too bad. I expected to gallop down a bit more, you know. But then again, you can't tell with this disease, you know.
Turner and Newell only focused on the suffering of asbestos victims like Doreen Percival when the company realized they were storing up huge compensation claims.
My own impression is that throughout the years, there was always an acceptable level of death until the mesothelioma claims started to pile up in the 60s and the 70s.
A company memo warned that the figures of asbestos-related disease were frightening. To win compensation, plaintiffs needed access to incriminating documents which would show the company knew the dangers all along. From 1975, Turner & Newell sold off the business of its subsidiary Newell's, but they held on to the Newell's shell by keeping the name. And they also buried the Newell's documents in their Manchester headquarters.
What was the effect of Turner & Newell retaining control of the shell company of Newell's Insulation?
If you control the shell, you control the process of knowledge. You file the list of documents saying you have nothing and you can't remember what you once had. At all stages, you have control.
The company were able to keep in the dark incriminating documents, even though they were honor-bound to disclose them to plaintiffs. But last February, a court case brought by one family ended years of cruel deceit.
The pier in Southend's been in our lives since we was that big. I mean, it's always been there, isn't it? It was the East Enders holiday home. It used to be 10 from Romford return.
Betty Standen was one of 3 women who married the Standen brothers, all of whom worked for Newell's. They're now experts on how Turner & Newell tried to bury its tainted past. Elsa Standen left her native Denmark to marry David in 1957. Pat Standen had married her husband Dick in 1950. He'd just left Newell's. The Standen family history was interwoven with Newell's. The 3 brothers had followed their father into the lagging business. It killed all 3.
Well, he got very, very thin, and the bones were really sort of, well, there's no flesh over it, and he used to fold a cloth up to sit on in the bath because he couldn't, it hurt. And then the last bath he had, he called me because he couldn't think how to get out of the bath. I think tablets and everything, he couldn't pull himself up. He had no energy.
All 3 women were to see at first hand the slow, agonizing death that comes from mesothelioma.
It was only skin, the bone in, and he was completely black. And the pain, that was just, even with all the, what he got for the pain, and it was just killing. And I was lucky enough because I know how to look after ill people, and I have promised myself he should die in the house he had built himself. And he did. He said he loved me. I said, I love you too. Then there was no more.
By 1979, when George Standen died, a generation was dead through mesothelioma. Their widows were determined Turner & Newell should pay. To prove liability, lawyers acting for Dick Standen's widow sought disclosure of any documents that showed Newell's had known about the health risks. When David Standen's widow also sued, the company told both women they no longer had access to any such documents whatsoever. That was untrue. They were being stored at their Manchester headquarters. The only documents the company did list were their husbands' work records.
My experience in asbestos cases is that the usual list of documents gives you absolutely zero and indicates that you can't expect us to remember what we once had many years ago.
Across the Atlantic, Turner & Newell's lawyers were telling quite a different story. Here in New York, the courts enforce much tougher discovery rules. A contract won in Manhattan in the heyday of asbestos was coming back to haunt T&N.
For your information.
When you look downtown in New York City today, you see something utterly new. A huge tower of glass and aluminum has pushed its way up in the stony canyon of Wall Street. One Chase Manhattan Plaza, new head office of New York's largest bank. It's the biggest office building that's been put up anywhere for about 25 years.
What we're looking at down there is the tip of Manhattan, and that contains the financial district in Wall Street. And 1 block off of Wall Street sits the Chase Manhattan Bank building. This 60-story skyscraper was built in the late 1950s. During the construction of the building, one of the products used was the sprayed limpid asbestos manufactured by Turner & Newell in England. The bank purchased the limpid asbestos in order to fireproof the steel floors of the building. You had here a major new building constructed in downtown Manhattan, and it allowed them to use that in their advertising, that they had been successful in obtaining the award for the fireproofing for this new skyscraper building. Now, 30 years later, we have to remove the asbestos from the building at an enormous cost to the bank and to its shareholders.
In 1987, Chase sued for $180 million. TNN are vigorously fighting the case, but the legal games they'd employed in Britain simply wouldn't have washed in America. A judge gave American lawyers the power to search TNN's British headquarters. They brought back so many documents, Chase has had to set up a vault of its own.
There's a cultural difference between the British legal system and the American legal system, so far as I can see. I think it's simply an attitude of mind that people will do the honourable, decent thing in England. American judges are, I suspect, much more cynical and determined to enforce proper discovery.
Chase's American lawyers were given powers unthinkable to British lawyers suing TNN.
In our case, the judge really gave us the power to roam through the repository, to see for ourselves, and to examine the documents as they existed in the drawers. It's my understanding from talking to British lawyers that really they have to make do with what the company gives them, and they do not get the opportunity to see for themselves the documents as they exist in the files.
American lawyers acting for Chase Manhattan here in New York have now brought back about 1 million documents from Manchester. It's a vivid reminder of why secrecy is so often called the British disease. If you really want to find out what goes on behind closed doors in Britain, come to America. And that's just what British lawyers acting for British victims have been obliged to do. Last summer, news of this American archive leaked out to Kieran May. It enabled him to demolish the legal walls that TNN had built around the Newell's papers. Kieran May was acting in the case of George Standen, the last of the brothers to die. He challenged Newell's claim to have no relevant papers without disclosing that they'd been found in New York. The company fell into the trap. A director swore on oath that he'd got no possession, custody or power over any documents.
It was untrue in two ways. Firstly, they had, in reality, an archive going back to the formation of the original group in 1920, and they had that because an American court had ordered them to create such an archive. Secondly, because Newell's Insulation was one of the founding fathers of Turner and Newell. So simply to say they hadn't got them anymore was not the truth. Turner and Newell had them.
We're talking about a whole family that worked there. Father and 3 brothers worked there, and father worked there over a period some 25, 30 years, plus 3 sons for him. How can you not have documents somewhere along the line which says you've got a whole family going through your books, same name? There's got to be something, surely. You know, I don't know. I was just shocked to think that they didn't seem to know anything about the family.
When TNN was confronted with the documents discovered in America, their legal director denied they'd run a false defense against Betty Standen by withholding them. But Newell's lost the case. They were held liable and had to pay £85,000 compensation.
I felt that there'd been an effort to cheat Mrs. Standen because knowledge was part of the defence against her, and frankly there was an effort to cheat the British courts, because if documents are not honestly put before the court, someone is trying to cheat the system.
We tried to put this allegation to TNN's present chairman, Colin Hope. Mr. Hope.
Yes.
My name is John Ware from the BBC. Could I have a brief word with you?
Yes, with pleasure.
I wanted to talk to you about Turner and Newell.
Right. TNN, please.
TNN,
That's
right.
the great.
What I want to ask you is this, and it relates to disclosure in courts, in British courts. Can you explain to me why it is that you're allowing your board to tell British courts that you have no documents that are relevant to health and asbestos issues, whereas your board or representatives of your board are telling American courts that you have got many of these
There is
documents.
absolutely no difference whatsoever between the position between British courts and American courts. We have carefully kept documents which other companies have not kept that related to our asbestos position. We are absolutely open, truthful and honest, and the documents are available for those courts who have a proper right. We are not prepared to allow those documents go to the press.
Not the press, no.
The press or anybody else in the media who thinks they have an entitlement to them.
No.
Legally, the courts may have access to those documents that they are properly entitled to. I've never heard such nonsense being prolonged. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Your people have been saying that they've got... Oh, yeah.
Would you mind just telling me whom you represent?
Yes, we represent BBC.
You do realise we have a
television.
complaint against the BBC?
I do realise you've got a complaint.
Thank you very much.
But Mr.
Thank you very much.
Well, why don't you
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Mr. Hope, why don't you answer my question? When are you going to answer these questions?
I've never heard such scandalous behaviour.
Well, will you just listen to my question and answer them?
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your place for the Mayfair cruise set. Mayfair cruise set.
TNN may challenge anyone who questions their honour, but the widows of Washington have been deceived, and elsewhere many more thousands have yet to be bereaved. At least TNN can no longer use sharp legal footwork to avoid owning up to its share of the blame.